Snoop Dogg was just trying to enjoy his flight in first class when things took a shocking turn. Dressed in his signature style, shades on, and laid back as always, he was ready for a smooth ride. But one person on that plane had a problem with him, the pilot. From the moment Snoop stepped on board, the captain's eyes were locked on him with an unsettling glare. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a misunderstanding. But as the flight went on, the tension grew thicker. Passengers around him started noticing the strange behavior. The pilot wasn't just doing his job. He was watching Snoop's every move, whispering to the flight crew, and making unnecessary appearances in the cabin. Then out of nowhere, the situation escalated. The pilot approached Snoop directly, his tone sharp, his body language aggressive. The entire first-class section fell silent. Was this really happening? Was a respected global icon being singled out for no reason? What happened next left everyone speechless. Some pulled out their phones, others gasped in disbelief. No one could have predicted how things would unfold in the next few minutes. Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Snoop Dogg leaned back in his seat, trying to keep his cool, but the energy in the cabin had completely shifted. The pilot, standing tall in his crisp uniform, didn't seem to care that all eyes were on him. His voice was low but firm as he spoke to Snoop, his expression unreadable. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was happening. Was there a real issue, or was this something else? The flight attendants hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but none of them stepped in. Snoop, always one to handle things with composure, simply adjusted his glasses and asked, "Is there a problem?" The pilot's jaw tightened. "I need you to follow the rules," he said, his tone carrying something unspoken. But what rules was he talking about? Snoop wasn't causing trouble. He had barely even spoken since the flight took off. A few people started whispering. Some passengers were already recording on their phones, sensing that this moment could turn into something bigger. The tension was thick, the pilot standing his ground, and Snoop remaining calm but visibly aware of what was happening. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, the pilot took a step closer. Snoop Dogg stayed seated, his expression calm but watchful. He wasn't new to situations like this. He had seen it all before. But something about the pilot's body language felt different. This wasn't just about rules. The air inside the first-class cabin was thick with unease, and the passengers could feel it. Some had stopped pretending not to notice, their phones still recording, waiting to see how this would play out. The flight attendants looked uneasy, shifting in place as if debating whether to step in. One of them, a young woman with a nervous smile, finally spoke. "Sir, is everything okay?" Her voice was careful, but the pilot barely acknowledged her. Instead, he kept his focus on Snoop. "I need you to listen," he said again, his tone sharper this time. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening," he said, his voice steady. A murmur spread through the cabin. The other passengers weren't sure what the issue was, but they could tell something was off. Snoop hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, the pilot was standing over him like he was waiting for something. A response? A reaction? Or was this something else entirely? The silence in the first-class cabin was deafening. The pilot's stance was firm, his eyes locked onto Snoop Dogg like he was waiting for something, some excuse to escalate the situation. But Snoop wasn't taking the bait. He adjusted his cufflinks, letting a small smirk cross his face, as if to say, asterisk, "I see what you're doing, asterisk." The tension only grew as passengers whispered among themselves, unsure of what they were witnessing. One man in a business suit leaned toward his seatmate and muttered, "Why is the pilot even out here?" A woman a few rows back shook her head, her phone still recording. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered. The flight attendants were visibly nervous now. The same young woman from before took a hesitant step forward. "Captain," she said carefully, "maybe we should return to the cockpit." But the pilot didn't move. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I know who you are," he said, his tone carrying an edge that sent a chill through the air. For the first time, Snoop's expression shifted. He studied the pilot, as if trying to read between the lines. And then, in one slow, deliberate motion, he removed his glasses. "Oh yeah," he said, his voice low. "Then you know I don't play these games." The entire cabin was locked in suspense. What was really going on here? And more importantly, what was about to happen next? The tension was almost unbearable. The pilot's stare was unrelenting, but Snoop didn't flinch. The energy in the cabin had shifted. This wasn't just a heated moment anymore. Something deeper was happening, and everyone could feel it. The murmurs grew louder, and even the flight attendants were exchanging uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. Then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, a voice cut through the silence from the back of the first-class cabin. "Excuse me, Captain." A tall man in a dark suit stood up, his face serious. No one had noticed him before, but now he had everyone's attention. He reached into his pocket, slowly pulling out a badge. "Federal Air Marshal," he said calmly. The pilot's face changed instantly. For a split second, there was something in his eyes, shock, maybe even fear. He straightened his posture, trying to regain control. "This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, but his confidence had wavered. Snoop leaned back, watching the scene unfold. The air marshal stepped forward, his tone firm. "Then explain," he said. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been harassing a passenger for no reason." The entire cabin was holding its breath. The pilot hesitated, his fists clenching at his sides. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than anyone had realized. And the truth was about to come out. The entire cabin was frozen, waiting for the pilot's response. His eyes darted between the air marshal and Snoop, as if calculating his next move. For a moment, it seemed like he might double down, but then he exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping. "This isn't about him," he muttered, his voice lower now. Snoop raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Then what's it about?" The pilot hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit before finally speaking. "There's something wrong with the flight," he admitted. "We've been receiving alerts from the system, but I didn't want to cause a panic." The passengers gasped. This was the last thing anyone expected. The air marshal stepped closer. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" The pilot shook his head. "Because I thought I could fix it. I didn't want people freaking out." He turned to Snoop. "But when I saw you, I knew you had the kind of influence to keep everyone calm if things went south." Snoop stared at him for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. "Man, you could have just said that instead of trying to play tough." Just then, the plane jolted. A warning light flashed above. Whatever was happening, they had bigger problems now. The cabin jolted again, and a tense silence fell over the passengers. The pilot turned on his heel and rushed back toward the cockpit, the air marshal close behind him. Snoop sighed, shaking his head. "Man, I knew something was off," he muttered. A few moments later, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've identified the issue, and we're making an emergency landing as a precaution. There's no need to panic." Relieved but still on edge, passengers exchanged nervous glances. Snoop remained calm, his presence alone helping to settle the nerves of those around him. He looked at the flight attendant from earlier and gave her a reassuring nod. See, we got this." She smiled, finally relaxing. As the plane descended, the tension eased, and by the time they landed safely, everyone let out a collective breath. As Snoop gathered his things, the pilot approached him, his expression softer now. "I owe you an apology," he admitted, "and a thank you." Snoop gave him a long look before cracking a grin. "Next time, just ask for help," he said, adjusting his glasses. And with that, he walked off the plane, as cool as ever.